Lesson 16, simplifying and evaluating variable expressions. In order to simplify and evaluate, we also need to understand what substitution is. That's just if you're given a statement with variables and they tell you what the variables equal, then you can substitute it in. So here's an example. If you're asked to evaluate in parentheses negative x plus a end parentheses minus parentheses x minus a end parentheses when a equals negative 8 and x equals 14. So what we can do is plug in for a and x all the way across this statement. So we can have parentheses negative 14 plus a negative 8 minus, we have x is 14 minus a negative 8. And we have negative 14 plus negative 8 is a negative 22. Minus, now when we do 14 minus negative 8, it's the same thing as adding a positive 8, which is 22. So negative 22 minus 22, because let's subtract, it's the same thing as adding the opposite. So negative 22 plus negative 22 is a negative 44. Sometimes we simplify before we evaluate. Sometimes we simplify before we evaluate. So here's an example. We're asked to evaluate this expression x parentheses x plus 2y end parentheses minus x when x equals 1/3 and y equals 1/2. Before we plug in for x and y, we're going to use the distributive property. So we have to take our x and times it by the first addend. Then we're going to add and take our x and times it by the second addend. We have to be sure and multiply by both. And then we're going to use our exponents and say x squared plus 2xy minus x. Then we can plug in 4x and y. So if x is 1/3, when we square it, well, let's just plug it in first. 1/3 squared plus, then we have 2 times 1/3 times 1/2, and then minus an x, which is 1/3. So we have 1/9 plus, because we're multiplying all these, I can cancel the 2's, turn them to 1's, and we get 1/3 minus 1/3. So when we see subtract, we can add the opposite. So same thing as saying 1/9 plus 1/3 plus a negative 1/3. And we know by the commutative or associative property, we can add these first. And since they're opposites, they go to 0. So it's just 1/9 plus 0, or 1/9. And that's the end of the lesson.